One thing to know about the news is that it changes in an instant, and that's what we're seeing today with a quick jury deliberation for the trial of Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin this morning was the man accused of killing George Floyd, and Derek Chauvin in this evening is now the man convicted of murdering George Floyd. Before we get into the specifics of this, I want to make one general point about why this story really matters. And it matters on a lot of different levels, as we've discussed. But what you should know is that in general, it is very, very rare to see a police officer charged, let alone convicted, when a death happens in custody. So we're seeing something pretty unusual here and something that we don't see very often. So let's dig into the particulars of what we now know. We know that Derek Chauvin was found guilty in all three charges. So second-degree murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter. The jury had the possibility of choosing any one of those charges, but they ended up convicting on all three counts. What's important to know is that these charges carry different sentencing, different sentencing guidelines, for example. And the charge of second-degree murder could lead to a sentence of 40 years, upwards of 40 years. However, because Derek Chauvin doesn't have a record, the likelihood of that is not very high. And so when you look at the actual guidelines and kind of dig in a little bit, the range of the sentencing for these charges is anywhere from 4 to 12 and a half years. And typically in Minnesota, they will choose the highest charge and sentence just on that if the charges are all about one single crime. But we're gonna have to wait a little while to learn what Derek Chauvin's fate is, because the judge will be the one that will sentence him, and the judge said that it will be another 8 weeks before we get to sentencing. Right now, Derek Chauvin is in custody. The judge thanked the jury for heavy-duty jury service. We'll watch to see if we have any jurors speak out about their decisions, but just think about this for a moment. Think about how our times are often defined by divisiveness, and yet we had a group of 12 strangers with very different backgrounds come together and reach a decision on this case in just about 10 hours. They had to do this through their own recollection and reflection on the trial. The judge said to them, there's no transcript of this. It's just your notes and your thoughts and reaching a decision here. And that's what they did. So it will be interesting to learn what actually went on in deliberations. Something to consider here, and something you might hear a lot about, is whether or not we will see an appeal in this case. Right before jury deliberations, the defense asked for a mistrial because of statements made by a Congresswoman Waters, who was at a protest in the Minneapolis area over the weekend, and said this: we got to stay on the street and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know we mean business. And so what the defense is saying is that her comments, because the jury was not sequestered, so they weren't in a hotel away from their family, that they could have heard those comments and somehow been prejudiced by them. And he said that to the judge, and the judge acknowledged that he did not appreciate those comments coming from a politician, or politicians in general in this case, but that he was not going to issue a mistrial. But that's something to watch because of what the president also followed up and said today. President Biden said this: I'm praying that the verdict is the right verdict, during a kind of a question and answer period between a journalist. And yes, the jury was sequestered at the White House, as the White House was pointing out. So the jury would not have heard these comments. But these comments can be used potentially by the defense to build a case that Derek Chauvin can't get a fair trial. And what's interesting is that we're not just watching Derek Chauvin. Remember, there's other officers on the scene, and there are 3 other officers that have been charged, lesser charges related to this crime. And so one of the questions we have now is, how does this court case and the outcome impact those other cases against these other officers? And what do we have to watch potentially about an appeal based on some of these comments from high-profile politicians? So these are a couple things that we're watching. Just a final thought as I'm looking over my notes and reflecting on the fact that we're getting this verdict less than a year after the incident itself took place. And that's remarkable for a few different reasons. American justice system sometimes doesn't move that quickly. We know there's been a lot of disruptions because of the pandemic for a lot of legal proceedings. So I'm noting the time in this, and I'm also reflecting on this question. There's a lot of divisiveness, obviously, about, or a lot of strong opinions about the case, right? The legal proceedings. There's a lot of strong opinions about this conversation about race in America. Here's my one question for you, no matter where you fall on that spectrum. Would we be here if there wasn't a video? If there wasn't a cell phone video? How much do you believe that cell phone video impacted this story?